Stage 1 Cadet Briefing. Mission Parameters. Begin by mapping the operational zone, its people, cultural contours, and the covert parameters that will shape your influence. The map surfaces cultural fault lines, the subtle grooves where narratives can find purchase and reroute perception. Identify media nodes and audience segments, the channels and receptors that will carry your signals. Trust metrics show where frames hold firm and where they can be nudged, the strategic pressure points of social capital. Trace historical rumor routes, how signals have previously hopped through existing networks and supply chains. Map cultural buffer zones and traditional fault lines, the safe lanes and the fracture points for narrative entry. Draft the initial narrative frameworks, the scaffolding that will hold the shadow state's messages. Monitor system entropy windows of chaos, where structured messaging can be introduced with greater effect. Approve contingency plans that protect campaigns from noise, disruption, and sudden counterpressure. Watch the simulated policy, public media loop, to see how perception evolves and where interventions matter most. You received the sealed dossier, the frame parameters that will seed the shadow state's foundational narrative. Stage 2 Lieutenant, crafting the narrative arsenal. Build the narrative arsenal, a curated database of frames, symbols, and signals tailored to cultural resonance. Algorithmic permutations surface symbols with the highest cultural receptivity and framing potential. Observe focus group reactions to refine language, cadence, and imagery until the frame lands naturally. Feed qualitative cues into framing experiments to recalibrate phrasing for maximum uptake. Moderator notes validate which frames stick and which need to be shelved. Track aggregate shifts in perceptual frames as simulated public opinion tilts in small, strategic increments. The strategist verifies early impact metrics to ensure components align with the broader shadow state objective. Finalize message architecture and cadence, how often and where each signal will surface for optimal retention. A crafted signal gleams on screen, scored for cultural resonance and projected framing impact. The review committee vets the narrative arsenal, checking phrasing, authority cues, and deployment schedules. You study prototype headlines, feeling the weight each frame will carry when exposed to the public. Technicians load tagged signal packages onto secure servers, ready for targeted delivery. Prepare the network, confirm exposure curves and node readiness before activation. Activation begins as local and international nodes propagate the first wave of signals across segmented audiences. Initiate the first wave, let the designed messages circulate through chosen media nodes. Engagement metrics flicker to life, beginning to trace the initial trace lines of rumor propagation. Map information flow across cultural buffers to anticipate where the signal will accelerate or stall. Fine-tune cadence in the coordination log, the rhythm determines whether a frame resonates or irritates. Trust metrics show subtle shifts, the first measurable signs of narrative penetration. An unexpected entropy spike triggers contingency talks, decide whether to amplify, dampen, or pivot the signal. Review propagation chains and deploy a framing trap to neutralize an emerging counter-narrative. Headline tickers carry subtle placement signals woven into everyday news streams. Watch participants echo planted phrases, early evidence that the frame is being rehearsed in everyday speech. Obsessively monitor saturation curves as adoption grows. Fatigue is part of stewardship. A junior analyst compiles real-time impact reports, cross-referencing media logs and social indicators. A new map layer highlights pockets of alignment, places where the narrative begins to feel native and systemic. Project long-term feedback loops to identify how institutional embedding will amplify or attenuate the narrative. Refine rumor models to trace precise information flow across targeted audience segments. Select insertion points within civil organizations where narrative elements can be embedded discreetly. Cross-reference live public rituals with the alignment matrix to spot organic integration opportunities. The policy public media loop maps the intended amplification path of embedded narrative elements. Fine-tune framing for public statements so official language dovetails with the shadow narrative. Observe how embedded cues in a public announcement resonate within a representative group. A local headline now carries a deployed frame, folded into everyday optics. Adjust segmentation tags in response to trust indicators and pockets of emergent resistance. Update the master deployment schedule, logging repetition counts across institutional partners. Alone, you watch saturation curves inch upward, the quiet metric of gradual cultural change. Buffer zone analysis exposes traditional fault lines where the narrative may meet entrenched resistance. Rehearse authority queue deployment with institutional representatives to ensure queues read as legitimate. Review feedback on how civil organizations retransmit the narrative and correct small deviations. Aligned message cadence with holidays and observances to weave the narrative into cultural rhythms. The schematic pinpoints where narrative threads can be introduced into public education and civic programs. Review the aftermath report to assess long-term perception residue and cumulative cultural effects. Prepare contingency protocols for information entropy spikes that could generate public confusion. A network graph shows key influencers who amplify messages and anchor institutional alignment. Draft a public statement that subtly reinforces the shadow narrative while remaining officially neutral. Review quarterly trust indicators to confirm steady gains in regions of deep narrative embedding. Stage 5 strategic review and exit. Assess long-term perception residue and weigh the ethical implications of the shadow state's existence.
Focus on the entropy
Present
reduction
mitigation protocols to manage lingering information entropy during disengagement. A truth surfacing timeline maps controlled de-escalation and projected exposure over years. Observe a simulated handover as legitimate institutions respond to alignment data and accept narrative elements. Note stable trust indicators that support a phased disengagement strategy. A controlled withdrawal protocol details step-by-step disengagement and schedules for public memory realignment. Weigh ethical reports and risk assessments to judge the acceptable legacy of the shadow state's influence. Log final debrief notes as the headline wall cycles through inert historical message cadence. Stand with the fading glow of the dashboard. The shadow state now operates autonomously, its traces woven into the system.